Few names in American criminal history carry the same lasting cultural weight as Ed Gein. He directly inspired three of the most influential horror films ever made: Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. Yet the real man behind those fictional monsters was, by most accounts from the people who actually knew him, a quiet, awkward, seemingly harmless farmer that his small Wisconsin community genuinely liked. What investigators found on his property in November 1957 would shock the nation, reshape American true crime forever, and remains one of the most disturbing criminal discoveries in United States history. A difficult childhood. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His early life was shaped almost entirely by his mother, Augusta Gein, a deeply religious and domineering woman who ran the household with an iron grip. She viewed the outside world, and particularly other women, as sinful and corrupting, and she worked relentlessly to isolate her sons, Ed and his older brother Henry, from any outside social influence. The family eventually moved to a secluded farm outside the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, further cementing that isolation. Augusta preached fire and brimstone sermons to her sons daily, warning them repeatedly about the moral corruption of women and the sinfulness of sexual desire, all while simultaneously being the single most important, dominant figure in Ed's entire emotional world. Ed's father, George, was a largely absent alcoholic figure, offering little in the way of counterbalance to Augusta's control. In 1940, George died. Then, in 1944, Ed's brother Henry died under circumstances that, decades later, still raise questions among historians. The two brothers had been burning marsh vegetation on the property when a fire got out of control. Henry went missing during the incident, and when searchers found him, he was dead, with some injuries that some investigators later found inconsistent with the fire alone. No formal charges were ever filed, and Henry's death was officially ruled accidental. With his father and brother both gone, it was now just Ed and his mother, alone together on the isolated farm. Losing his mother. In 1945, Augusta Gein suffered a stroke. Ed cared for her devotedly during her recovery, but a second stroke followed not long after, and on December 29, 1945, Augusta died. For Ed Gein, this loss was catastrophic. His entire world, his only real relationship, the dominant force that had shaped every part of his psychology since birth, was suddenly gone. Rather than moving forward with his life, Ed sealed off most of the farmhouse entirely, preserving his mother's bedroom and the downstairs parlor almost exactly as she had left them, essentially turning them into a shrine. He continued living in the house, but confined himself mostly to a small room off the kitchen, leaving the rest of the home frozen in time. Neighbors in Plainfield still considered Ed a bit odd, but generally harmless, a quiet man who occasionally did odd jobs and babysat local children, someone the community had simply grown used to as a fixture of small-town life. What none of them knew was what Ed had begun doing, alone, at night. A decade of secret grave robbing. Beginning around 1947 and continuing for roughly the next decade, Ed Gein began systematically robbing graves in local cemeteries. According to his own later confessions, he specifically targeted the graves of middle-aged women who, in his mind, resembled his deceased mother. He would exhume the bodies, sometimes taking the entire corpse, other times removing specific body parts before reburying what remained. He later told investigators he sometimes entered what he described as a trance-like state during these nighttime excursions, and claimed he genuinely believed that through these acts, he might somehow be able to bring his mother back. Investigators, and later, the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, would go on to classify much of this behavior not as sexually motivated in the traditional sense, but as an extreme, ritualized grief response, an attempt, however disturbed, to hold on to or recreate the maternal presence he had lost. By his own admission, Gein exhumed bodies from at least 9, and by some estimates as many as 40, grave sites over the following decade, all without a single person in Plainfield ever suspecting a thing. The disappearance of Mary Hogan. On December 8, 1954, a local tavern owner named Mary Hogan vanished from her bar in nearby Pine Grove. Investigators found blood on the floor, suggesting something violent had occurred, but with no body and no immediate suspect, the case went cold and remained unsolved for years. The disappearance of Bernice Worden. Nearly 3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old widow who owned the local hardware store in Plainfield, went missing. Her son, Frank, who also worked in law enforcement, grew immediately suspicious when he discovered the store's cash register missing and noticed a sales receipt indicating that Ed Gein, a regular customer, had been in the store the previous evening. Investigators went to Gein's isolated farmhouse that same day to question him. The discovery what deputies found on the property that afternoon would go down as one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. In an unheated shed attached to the property, they discovered Bernice Worden's body, hanging by her ankles from a wooden crossbeam. She had been decapitated, and her body had been mutilated in a manner investigators described as resembling the field dressing of a deer carcass. But the horror didn't end there. When investigators moved into the farmhouse itself, they discovered an almost incomprehensible scene. Bernice Worden's head was found inside the house. Throughout the home, investigators cataloged numerous items crafted from human remains. Bowls fashioned from human skulls, a lampshade, and several chair seats covered in preserved human skin, and a collection of masks made from the carefully removed facial skin of multiple different women. Perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators discovered what they described as a woman's suit, a wearable vest constructed from a preserved female torso, complete with breasts, which Gein later admitted he would occasionally put on and wear. In total, remains belonging to at least 15 different women were identified throughout the property, a combination of Gein's confirmed murder victims and the numerous bodies he had exhumed from local graves over the preceding decade. The confession. Ed Gein was taken into custody and questioned extensively by the local district attorney and investigators. He confessed calmly and, according to those present, with an unsettling lack of emotional affect, to murdering both Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He also detailed, in methodical fashion, his years of grave robbing, explaining his selection process and his belief that these acts connected him somehow to his late mother. Despite the sheer scale of what investigators found, Gein was ultimately only formally charged with the murder of Bernice Worden. Prosecutors determined that pursuing additional charges related to Mary Hogan's murder, or any of the grave robbing incidents, wasn't necessary or practical given the overwhelming case already in front of them, and would have required significant additional resources without changing the eventual outcome. Found unfit for trial. In late 1957, Gein was evaluated by psychiatrists and diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was declared unfit to stand trial and was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. In a strange postscript, on March 20, 1958, the night before his now infamous farmhouse was scheduled to be publicly auctioned off, an event that had drawn intense, morbid national curiosity, the house mysteriously burned to the ground. Investigators were never able to determine a definitive cause, though arson by an angry or disturbed local resident was widely suspected at the time. 10 years later, the trial Gein remained under psychiatric care for the next decade. In 1968, doctors determined he had become mentally competent enough to participate in his own legal defense, and he was finally put on trial for the murder of Bernice Worden. Judge Robert Golmar presided over the case. The court found Gein guilty of murder, but under Wisconsin law at the time, also determined he had been legally insane at the moment the crime was committed. As a result, rather than being sent to prison, Gein was returned to psychiatric custody. The rest of his life, Ed Gein spent the remainder of his life in mental institutions, eventually settling at Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, from 1974 until his death. By most staff accounts, he became something of a model patient over the years, quiet, cooperative, and engaged in occupational therapy. He died on July 26, 1984, from complications related to lung cancer and respiratory failure, at the age of 77. A legacy in American horror, Ed Gein's crimes, though numerically far smaller in confirmed victim count than many other infamous serial killers, left an outsized mark on American culture, specifically because of their sheer psychological strangeness. Author Robert Bloch, living not far from Plainfield at the time, was reportedly inspired directly by the case when writing his 1959 novel Psycho, which Alfred Hitchcock adapted into his landmark 1960 film the following year. Gein's story would go on to influence Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, two of horror cinema's most enduring and disturbing villains. More than 6 decades later, Ed Gein remains a subject of ongoing fascination, most recently the focus of a major true crime dramatization in 2025. Some historians, including the judge who presided over his original sanity hearing, have even raised lingering questions over the years about whether Gein may have had help with some of his crimes. Questions that, like much else about this deeply disturbing case, have never been fully resolved. What remains clear is this: behind the horror movie legend was a real, deeply isolated, and profoundly disturbed man, shaped almost entirely by an overwhelming, suffocating relationship with his mother, and by a grief so extreme it drove him to violate the dead, and eventually, the living, in ways that would haunt American culture for generations to come.